This is a detailed lecture on coercion, which generally is usually a wrongful threat that denies a person the free will to enter into the contract. Now, the threat may include anything from that of bodily harm or even death, and the threat is usually made against the contracting party himself or herself, or sometimes to their immediate family members. And of course, the threats can also be against the party's home. So let's look at the formal definition, which is given in section 15 of the Contract Act 1872, according to which coercion is the committing or threatening to commit any act which is forbidden by the PPC, that is the Pakistan Penal Code, or it may also be the unlawful detaining or threatening to detain any property with an intention of causing any person to enter into an agreement. Now, this definition obviously sounds scary, but let me break it down for you. So essentially, any act that is forbidden by the PPC. So a reference to the PPC should not intimidate you. It simply means that any act which is forbidden by the Pakistan Penal Code, that is the code which lays down all of the offences essentially. So just remember that coercion can be broadly subdivided into two types. The first one is where you are committing or threatening to commit any act forbidden by the Pakistan Penal Code. That's the first broad category, that is any crime that falls under the PPC. And the second broad category is basically relating to detention of property, whether you are actually detaining property or whether you are just threatening to detain property. So remember that there are two categories. The first one simply relates to acts which are forbidden by the Pakistan Penal Code, in short, the acts that are forbidden by PPC. And the second broad category simply relates to the detaining of somebody's property. Okay, so let's look at examples. As far as the first category is concerned, a very simple example is that let's say that A beats up B, that is another person, and compels him to sell his car to him for merely an amount of 20,000 rupees. Now, in this situation, B's consent has obviously been obtained on the basis of coercion, that is by the use of actual physical force, which is obviously forbidden by the PPC, which is why this particular situation is going to fall under the first broad category, that is coercion by the committing or threatening to commit of any act which is forbidden by the PPC. And remember that I just said that it can be either the committing of the act or the threatening to commit any act. So it's irrelevant. For example, if we change our example a little bit and say that A has not yet beaten up B, but that A has threatened to beat B if B does not sell his car to him. So even the threat alone to commit any act which is forbidden by the PPC is going to be sufficient. So this is basically the first broad category, that is coercion is the committing or threatening to commit any act which is forbidden by the PPC. Now let's look at the second broad category, that is let's look at an example for this one. Okay, now let's look at an example for the second broad category. Okay, so let's say that Mr. C threatens Mr. D that he is going to seize the property of Mr. D if Mr. D does not go ahead and sell his house to him. Now, this situation obviously illustrates the second category of coercion, because we see that one person is threatening to detain the property of another person and the other person is being forced into entering the contract on the basis of this threat. And of course, we can also change this particular example, and for instance, Mr. C had actually gone on to detain Mr. D's property, and in this particular situation, once again, it would fall under the second broad category of coercion, which deals with the detaining of one's property. Okay, so I repeat once more that coercion can broadly take place in two ways. Number one is the committing or the threatening to commit any act which is forbidden by the PPC. That's number one. And the second broad category is basically unlawfully detaining or threatening to detain anyone's property so as to force that person to enter into a contract with you. So first category simply involves anything against the PPC, whether you're actually committing that act or whether you're merely threatening to commit any act. And the second broad category involves anything relating to the detaining of certain property that belongs to the other person, whether you have actually detained it or whether you're merely threatening to detain the property. So the key word for the first category is anything forbidden by the PPC, and the key word for the second category is detaining property. And one more thing to notice is that basically there are 4 types of coercion. Why? Because the first category itself involves 2 possibilities and the second category also involves 2 possibilities. And of course there is nothing to be confused about, because like I just said, the first broad category is simply either the commitment of the act or threatening to commit any act, and similarly the second broad category also involves either unlawfully detaining any property or threatening to detain someone's property. So basically it's either committing the act or threatening to commit that act, which is basically why we have 2 further subdivisions in the categories. Okay, so before I conclude this lecture, there's one additional important point that you need to know. So remember that it is irrelevant, that is, it's immaterial, that the PPC may not be in force at the particular place where coercion is employed. What does matter, that is what is important, is that the suit, that is the case, has to be filed in Pakistan, and obviously the provisions of the PPC are going to apply as long as the suit or the case has been filed in Pakistan. But the actual place where coercion was employed may or may not be in Pakistan. That's the important point to remember. So let's look at a very quick example. So let's say that 2 Pakistani people, Mr. A and Mr. B, are in the UK, and one fine day Mr. A finds Mr. B, beats him up and forces him to agree to sell his house to him as soon as they reach Karachi. And they also enter into a formal agreement, that is, a proper contract is concluded, whereby Mr. B agrees to sell his house to Mr. A. Now obviously there is the use of physical force, which means a violation of the PPC. So when these 2 people reach Karachi, and Mr. A is going to obviously sue Mr. B for breach of contract, because when Mr. B refuses to go ahead with the agreement to sell his house, then Mr. A is going to be angry and he would want to go ahead with the contract, and therefore he is going to sue for breach of contract. But since Mr. A had employed coercion, so it does not matter that at the time the coercion was employed, they were both abroad, that is, they were both in the UK and not in Pakistan. So it's irrelevant that the PPC was not in force at the time or place where the act was done. What is relevant is the fact that the suit has been filed in Pakistan. So that's it for this lecture. In short, coercion is simply compelling a person to enter into a contract under pressure or a threat. And there are 4 types of coercion as per section 15, and we've looked at the relevant examples for each type. And one important point to remember is that it's irrelevant whether or not the PPC is in force at the place where the coercion takes place.